We are streaming live online today, part 128, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
Today, we will take up some questions on time, spirit, and the mood of an era. During our discussion, you may freely ask questions in the chat box on our YouTube channel. And we ask you to send questions beforehand on our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com. We will start with a letter that we received from Maya. I was wondering if it would be relevant to share some thoughts about Queen Elizabeth passing away yesterday. The Queen reigned for exactly 70 years, and this summer we had celebrations for her Platinum Jubilee throughout the UK, ending in a moving balcony scene where the Queen greeted the crowds, and there was a spontaneous national anthem. I think many people felt it would be the last time they would see her. Sure enough, she died just a few weeks after the celebrations. The timing seemed very uncanny and predestined. She has represented an entire era in our recent history, whether it be good or bad, and it feels her passing symbolizes a part of the old world that has died, and many people felt emotionally affected even if they didn't know her personally. About an hour after her death, double rainbows broke out right above both Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, her two official residences. We do not get rainbows very often in the UK. Is there any significance to seeing rainbows after someone dies? For example, I know sometimes rainbows appear over the ashram on Darshan days. And do you think her death is significant in heralding a new period of change, instability, or breakdown of current social structures? Are global figures such as her bigger instruments of the divine due to their reach and influence? And therefore, is it a greater significance when they die? Or is the global interest due to vital excitement, and should the event be no greater than anyone else's death? This is Maya's first question, then we will move after to her second question.
Yes, it's very topical and also very important, and it becomes an occasion for us to explore a certain aspect of how things work behind the scenes. Some of my observations may not always be in consonance with, let's say, current fashionable ideas, but my effort will be to try to present things from a deeper spiritual perspective, in which our human values do not necessarily have a very prominent place. That is, our human values of right and wrong or good or bad. And so here, first, we will use this question to step back and look at a bigger picture. From the very beginning of Earth's evolution, there has been a constant effort to push forward the evolution. This is true everywhere in the universe, but we are concerned with the Earth. From the point where that has taken a more and more human form of the mind consciousness emerging, that effort has acquired specific focus. From the point where the mind began to get more and more complex in its capacities, the effort has acquired a multifaceted push. Over time, across the globe itself, different aspects, different powers, different qualities, different psychological temperaments were as if built up, fused, again dispersed, specialized, again built up, fused, etc. It's a very complex, long work of designing, constructing, building, developing a certain potential. Now, at some level, we can say all of this is the push of the divine will secretly within, individualized through the human soul and through souls. But there's something else which is a larger collective consciousness, which also becomes, so to say, a vehicle, a container, an incarnating body for certain aspects of the divine to manifest, which make for distinctive phases, eras, civilizations, cultures, and so on, which, having served their purpose, sometimes nature allows them to fall apart and takes out certain key components of it to spread, to rebuild, to intensify, and then again bring together and build something more. But all this, remember, is constantly resisted by the individual outer nature, resisting, of course, the soul's influence, but also in the collective consciousness, the crude, coarse humanity of the past phases is not a very receptive vehicle for a high spiritual consciousness and can only catch certain aspects. Or the consciousness working through the coarse vehicle will use its coarser instincts to push forward certain actions which will assist something more refined to eventually develop. This distinction is very important to recognize. So one of the things which came up when the Queen passed away is quite a large number of people in certain countries that had been colonized by the British Empire began to celebrate. They blamed her for their colonization, which is not true, which is not correct. On a very superficial level, you distinguish between the monarchy and the constitution and the parliament and the political forces, and behind those political forces, what we have earlier referred to as the cabal, which have their own agendas. She may or may not be a part of that. We do not know always. Sometimes elements of the family might be, some may not be. But in most cases, you will find in the British constitutional monarchy, the king or queen are figureheads. If they do not do what they are asked to rubber stamp by the greater powers behind, they could even be quietly assassinated, because they are, so to say, puppets of a whole machinery, entirely dependent on the household people looking after them. And if one of those people, and obviously some of them are there to control her, if one of them were to put poison in her food, there is no way she can ever know. And so effectively, the king, queen would always be puppets of this machinery. To the extent that in the past they had a choice to keep their own servants, they could build trusts, but even there, as you know, in history, some of the most trusted have killed their masters, and this is all over the world. But from the point where England became a constitutional monarchy, the actual power is with the politicians and the people behind who control them, and not necessarily with the Queen. So I want to highlight this distinction first. And so when people blamed her for the colonial phase, it's not necessarily correct. She inherited the British Empire, so to say. And at a time, I think it was 1952, when already the empire had begun to break. India had just been lost by the British Empire. And you will see the British Empire was very closely connected to the ownership of India. From the point, British came in as traders, from the point where their control of land in India began to grow, they began to ascend in global affairs. From the point when they had seized complete control of India, the British Empire became all-powerful on the wealth of India, in a great part, and grew to be the empire where the sun never sets, because it was spanning the whole world, in a large part funded from Indian wealth and Indian soldiers, Indian traders, etc. So from the point they lost India, the entire big empire began to collapse, and rapidly. So actually during her period, the empire was largely collapsing, and there were two ways it could happen. it could have taken on a crushing power to suppress, or it could have allowed a peaceful transfer of power. As we see in India, the transfer happened during her father's reign, where India was split deliberately as part of a strategy, as we see generally everywhere. But what we do see elsewhere is that there was a reasonably smooth transition and transfer of power that took place under her reign. More important, all this is still just to the superficial part. More important is to recognize what were the forces and powers working from behind, both the negative as well as the positive, and who would be instruments for these. So in a large part, elements in the royal family and elements of the cabal that control the political structure in England, which to this day control the banking system in England, from which they control the gold prices, silver prices, and there's a whole bank of, I think it's the Bank of London, which literally controls the financial system globally. This is still the focal point for the control system of global finances. These represented largely the influence of selfishness, domination, control, subjugation, etc., and often with very strong asuric elements and objectives. She was one of the very few within that structure of power who actually represented an aspect of light. She embodied certain things. It was, in fact, a great opportunity for England, and because of England's power in the world, for the world, because of the exercise of that power, that there was somebody of such positive benevolence and light. Certain aspects in her actually had a very strong spiritual influence behind that was working through her, to a great extent minimizing or limiting the other sides and their play in the, let's say, British political agendas. And so coming to her personally, there was something extraordinary working from behind. She was open to that to some extent, seemed to be conscious of it also. And the power behind, in a sense, every great person in power finally comes under influences of certain powers, of the chair or the power behind the throne often seizes them. In her case, it was a positive, evolutionary, spiritual power. There have been others, as we see in Africa, when the British withdrew, you had Idi Amin taking over, who had a tremendous negative asuric character even, and others subsequently in various spaces, various countries. So what you see is whenever somebody is in a position of power, of authority, there is automatically behind the seat a certain influence, but if they are open and have a choice of an inner alignment, they can also choose whether they align more with the light or with the forces of darkness. In her case, there was a distinct swing to open to the influences of light, whatever the limitations of her actual capacity to assert herself, which is why I described that earlier portion of the queen being a puppet. But still, the fact that she could hold that in spite of others in the family or in the polity who might have been differently inclined was a huge saving grace and an influence for whatever it could do through that influence. To some extent, her son, Prince Charles, has this opening also. I do not think he has the same kind of receptivity and openness, and the aspect of the divine light behind is not as strong. But there's a general sense of goodwill. But as I've said, there is always the limitation of the control around them. So coming to this question itself, yes, she was an exceptional instrument, and not all global figures are such exceptional instruments. Some are, and where they are, then a lot of work can be done, both positively and negatively, by the influences that they open to. Her passing is significant. The timing, even the sense of the date is quite interesting. I did not know about this observation of about the rainbows appearing, but yes, that also does happen when there is some major transition of this kind. there is a tendency for things around to align, to fall into place, expressing the nature of that transition. You will recall, and this is recorded uh, publicly, officially, that when the Second World War was, well, on the brink, and the then British Prime Minister was resisting, avoiding, delaying, eventually he had no choice. And then at some point in the parliament, when the discussions were going on, he said helplessly, he said finally he had to give in. He said, "So it is war." And the moment he said it is war, there was a massive sound of roar of thunder, so loud as to drown everything and shake the building. This gives you a sense of how these things happen. It's as if there are powers behind, and human beings are almost like puppets, and they work through these. And when there are strong alignments or strong shifts in the working, such as in this case, the acceptance against all resistance, the final giving in, it's as if a spring which has been building up a pressure is suddenly released. And a chain of events now are inevitable in their unfolding. And so at the release of that force is often accompanied by some alignments. And in this case, it was the thunder. Equally with transitions of this kind, where there's a strong spiritual influence, there can be an image or appearances such as this, or a mood or a presence also which can be felt. It all depends on the receptivity of the people, who may also open to receive something of a higher light. What is interesting is there's another alignment that particularly I noticed. The day the Queen died is also the day that in India, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated a very large section in Delhi, which used to be known earlier as the King's Way under British colonial rule. When India became independent, they renamed it to the Sanskrit equivalent. King's Way became Raj Path. So Raj is royal, Path is way, path. And this has been under renovation as part of the agenda of the current Prime Minister, who on 15th August announced that one of the objectives for India's development is to be free of the colonial mentality or the influence of the colonized mind, and with it, of course, the symbols of colonization. And just on that day, the day the Queen passed on, he inaugurated that whole part, which used to be Rajpath, and renamed it as Kartavya Path. Kartavya in Sanskrit would be responsibility or duty or the right thing to be done. And the path of the right responsibility or duty. And he declared this as the transition from the colonial influence and freedom from colonized India. So it's something very important to recognize. Even as in India, this symbolic transition was being made, at the same time, the Queen leaves the body and marks the end of that whole, the last queen or the last royal head to have ruled during a colonial period. And as you can see also subsequently, particularly in the last 20 years, England has rapidly declined in every way in terms of influence also. But the timing was amazing. It was so perfect. Here is a declaration of freedom from the colonial mental influence, and there is the ending of somebody who symbolized the last of the colonial era. It is not a coincidence. There are, so to say, deeper forces, as I said, alignments of energies, which were involved. This is something which I had been saying for quite a while now, maybe for the last 25 years, quite openly. I said in 1947, India got political independence from British rule, but it had not yet got economic independence, cultural independence, mental independence. You see, to throw off the colonial mentality and the way of thinking of a colonized mind itself, and then the spiritual freedom. So economic freedom, cultural freedom, mental freedom, and spiritual freedom. So of these, in a sense, this Rajpath renaming and the formal declaration by the Prime Minister of India that we have to end colonization and this is the end of the symbol of colonization of the mind, to me was very significant. Because if you recall, the very first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, was not elected, as you know. He was selected by Gandhi and imposed on the others against their choice of election, which is very strange. The first step of democracy is to suppress the voice of the democracy and select a person. And Nehru proudly said to the ambassador of the United States, Kenneth Galbraith, who records it faithfully in his memoirs, Nehru leaned in a conspiratorial whisper and said to Kenneth Galbraith, you know, I am the last Britisher to rule India. Think about it. The first Prime Minister of India, rather than celebrating independence, considers himself great because he is a Britisher. And it is said that he used to send his clothes to be dry cleaned to Europe. And I don't know how far it is true. But the point is this mentality that he still was proud of being a colonizer of India, and his responsibility is to rule India, not to serve India. And that mentality stayed and stayed and stayed through the whole political period. Narendra Modi, when he became Prime Minister the first time, was the first to declare in the public speech that he gave that I am not Prime Minister, but I am Prime Servant of the people of India, and my job is to serve India. That represented a shift. Of course, you can say it was just rhetoric, but what you saw subsequently in action has been visible. But this declaration of the freedom from the colonized mind to me was very significant, and the timing was quite amazing to see also. So yes, there is certainly a shift and the end of an era. And there are individuals, in a sense, who embody the power of the era, sometimes for a specific location, for a specific action or influence. And for sure, this queen was embodying something of this aspect, Queen Elizabeth. Not always consciously, sometimes consciously. My sense of it when seeing her in some of the videos was that she was conscious on some level that she held something. And as long as she held it, it had its effect on the people. With her passing, it's as if that force, the power she held, also loosens up, unless it finds another container which can hold it. Prince Charles, I suppose now he will be King Charles, does not have the same capacity that she had, or at least not for that aspect that she held. So either he invokes something else and holds, or he does not, or he holds some reflected aspect with a limited capacity. That is to be seen. But for sure, this represents a transition, and an influence that she held now will shift. And it is to be seen how this will work out. I don't want to anticipate, but one can also already see certain tendencies which her presence held back from full play of dissolution, which now is no more there. So now I want to comment a little bit on that phase of the colonization. Having said that she was not directly responsible for it, one can of course say as long as she chooses to be a ruler, she still takes the burden of the responsibility, yes. But behind that, we see on the front the interests, including the interests of the cabal which wanted to rule the world and subjugate the whole world in a colonial ownership, let's say, and a loot, and a massive financial loot, the likes of which is unheard of in human history, was taking place from India to England. India was at that time producing 25% of global industrial output. England was nowhere. The entire transfer of wealth and power from India took place, and the destruction of all the industries. And it's too long a story to narrate, it would take a couple of hours. But at the end of which, when the British left, India was left poor to owning less than 1% of global industrial output, with a decimation of, over time of the British rule, something like 40 to 50 million people by starvation, by death, and by other various forms. And this is quite radical. The start of British rule, we see 30 million Indians dying of starvation as a result of British policies. The end of British rule, we see about 4 to 5 million in the West Bengal and Orissa region dying of starvation because the grain they produced was taken away by the British Army for Greece and other places which didn't need it, while people here were dying, the people who had grown the grain. So yes, there is a karmic burden on England overall. And yet, whatever may have been the human compulsions, behind that is a divine power that is using the human compulsions to exercise its own objectives. And this is what I want to come to now. That's why I said it may be a little controversial, because we have now to disengage from the human, both greed as well as the consequent suffering on the other side, and look at things from a higher spiritual force. Remember, when the spiritual power is pushing a humanity that is still barbaric, it cannot necessarily inspire human beings to the spiritual ideal because they are too barbaric. So it works through the barbaric instincts, but subtly nudges and directs them to produce outcomes and lead the evolution forward. So I'm going to read something of what Sri Aurobindo had to say regarding this particular aspect of the British rule, because he was supporting the Allies during the Second World War. There were many questions, and I will read some portions from one of the letters where he says, "What I have said is not that the Allies have never done wrong things, but that they stand on the side of the evolutionary forces. I have not said that at random, but on what to me are clear grounds of fact. What you speak," somebody is complaining about their crimes, "what you speak of is the dark side. All nations and governments have shown that side in their dealings with each other, at least all who had the strength or got the chance. I hope you're not expecting me to believe that there are or have been virtuous governments and unselfish and sinless peoples. It is only individuals, and not too many of them, who can be described in that style." And I believe this queen was one such. But there is the other side also. That was my parenthetical comment. Sri Aurobindo says, but there is the other side also. I'm skipping because it's a long letter. America, France, England, the present allied nations, they all have been imperialistic and still bear the burden of their past. But they have also deliberately spread these ideals and introduced self-governing bodies and parliamentary institutions where they did not exist. You see, this is very important. And whatever the relative worth of these things, they have been a stage, even if a still imperfect stage, in a forward evolution. What of the others? What about the Axis new powers? Hitler swears it is a crime to educate the colored people. They must be kept as serfs and laborers. Now, here you have to see, you may condemn British Empire for whatever it might have done, let's say the suffering and the loot in India, Africa, elsewhere. But the other is what you have to compare with as an alternate. Now he comes specifically. England has helped certain nations to be free without seeking any personal gain. She has conceded independence to Egypt and Ayr after a struggle, to Iraq without a struggle. On the whole, she has been for some time moving away steadily from imperialism towards a principle of free association and cooperation. So this is happening already within the British mind and in the higher, let's say, elite who are also controlling and influencing thought as well as political objectives. The British Commonwealth of England and the Dominions is something unique and unprecedented, a beginning of new things in that direction. She is turning in spirit in the direction of a world union of some kind after the war. She is turning in spirit in the direction of a world union of some kind after the war. Her new generation no longer believes in an imperial mission. She has offered India dominion independence. Even if she prefers it, she can choose or pass on to isolated independence after the war, on the base of an agreed free constitution to be chosen by Indians themselves. Though this, it has been feared, leaves a loophole for reactionary delay, it is still extremely reasonable, and it is the Indians themselves with their inveterate habit of disunion who will be responsible if they are imbecile enough to reject the opportunity. So, it's all right for us to say, oh yes, colonization, etc. But you have to see the powers behind. Utilizing human greed, power, influence, domination, etc. to build an influence that took up literally at some point the whole world, and except for a few patches, and where it was too fallen, too confused, too dark to lift and raise and bring institutions, whatever their limitations, which pushed forward towards evolution, even if it was on the suffering of India, on the loot of India, on the death of millions. At the end of the day, it served in a larger objective for shaping the Indian civilization. There's a text which I had read before, I think a couple of years ago in one of these sessions. I could not find it just now, where Sri Aurobindo describes how in the Indian temperament, these are the flaws, and he lists all the flaws and limitations. And then he says precisely the British had the very characteristics which were required to counter these flaws. And therefore, if India had to be under colonial domination, there could not have been a better domination than the British, who could bring in just this which was required and not interfere with the rest of the civilizational values, which, as we do see, happened. And so it is, in fact, from a divine perspective, yes, ideally there should have been no colonization. But given the condition of the Indian people and this phrase, inveterate habit of disunion, even imbecile enough to reject the opportunity, and that's way back in the 1940s. Go back 200 years, it was far worse. That the colonial entry was, first of all, made possible by that. And having come in, there was a choice. It could have been the Dutch, it could have been the French. And you see everywhere that the French went, there is nothing of the native language and culture. They became Frenchisized. Or the Dutch similarly completely converted. There were others. Portuguese were far worse. And there was, as you know, in Goa, even the continuation of the Inquisition 200 years or 100 years after it had ended in England. So things could have been far, far, far worse. And under Islamic rule, you can see the destruction of everything. So the British coming in, if at all there had to be colonization, that was the best. And in terms of the shaping required for the Indian temperament type, civilizational limitations and lacuna, that was the best fit. Their leaving should have been smooth. And if not for Mahatma Gandhi, it could have happened at the right time, which was in the early 1920s. Unfortunately, that was delayed, which led to many more things and eventually ended in partition. But there again, it could have been avoided if not for this, as you can see, imbecile enough to reject the opportunity, which did happen by the same group. So all that, I'm quoting Sri Aurobindo, I'm not saying anything on my own here. All that is what I call evolution in the right direction, however slow and imperfect and hesitating. So this is what the Allies stand for, and particularly he's speaking of England and the colonial, the British Empire and the direction it was moving towards. This is very interesting. When he's saying this, that already there was a tendency to move towards a world union through the British Empire as a first step. It would have happened after the war. Had India become free, united without this division, India would have been one of the leaders for this organization of the World Union. For a long time, the thing which was known as the British Commonwealth was in fact one of the vehicles for holding such a unit, let's say. And so It could have been leveraged better for organizing differently. But as you can see, these were opportunities. Somewhere humanity was not sufficiently ready. The opportunities were only half-heartedly used. I continue with Sri Aurobindo's text. As for America, she has forsworn her past imperialistic policies in regard to Central and South America, in Cuba, the Philippines, everywhere apart from some islands in the Pacific, which would go plop into other hands if she withdrew from them. So, in a sense, Sri Aurobindo is master strategist, political master also. He's seeing all the outcomes and telling you also what America did in a positive way and the direction she was heading. It is perhaps possible, some suggest, that she may be tempted towards a sort of financial imperialism, the rule of the almighty American dollar, by her new sense of international power, or led into other mistakes. But if so, we may fairly assume from her other strong tendencies that she will soon withdraw from it. Very interesting. He's literally telling you there's this possibility of the almighty American dollar becoming a financial imperialism, which, as you know, did happen, had been for a long time. The worst phase of it was when they started this war on terror with 2001 and the invasion of the Middle East and all that, and the attempt to subjugate the whole world to the influence of the American dollar and military. And it's quite surprising, one of the statistics I had read, that American troops were present in more than 150 nations as a permanent presence, or involved in war in permanent presence. And you never see this in the media. So common man knows nothing about what the game really was. So yes, this is a strong tendency. The impulses he is describing, the new sense of international power, or into other mistakes. But he says, we may fairly assume that her other strong tendencies will make her withdraw again, which is what we saw also happening in the last, let's say, 6 years. And this happened during Trump, where all the withdrawal of the troops began. The war in the Middle East was shut down. No new wars were started. That was the only president under whom no new wars started. And instead, a withdrawal process started. And focusing to rebuild America rather than expend its energy and its youth and finances into controlling the world. So, and that movement, although it began then, has not really been fully reversed. It is still there. So, the greater danger is that she may retire again into a selfish isolationism after the war, and so destroy or delay the chance of a possible beginning that may lead eventually to some beginning of a free world union. Very interesting here. That is, Sri Aurobindo is saying, if the United States withdrew into selfish isolationism after the war, then this chance of beginning a free world union would be delayed. It's very interesting. That means America had to play that role, was meant to play that role in a sense. And the mother said until the United States entered Vietnam, there was great hope. And of course, with Kennedy, that would have actually happened. But from the point where the US entered into Vietnam and started that war, mother said things have changed. And then she was silent about that potential. And then still Sri Aurobindo says, but still there again is the evolutionary force. Then he continues, is there a similar trend on the part of the Axis? The answer is plain enough, both from their own declarations and their behavior. And he says, avowedly and openly, Nazi Germany today stands for the reversal of this evolutionary tendency, for the destruction of the new international outlook, the new dharma, for a reversion not only to the past, but to a far back primitive and barbaric ideal. She fully intended to reimpose it on the whole earth, and would have done so if she had had, as for some time she seemed to have, the strength to conquer. There is no doubt or hesitation here. If we are for the evolutionary future of mankind, we must recognize that it is only the victory of the allies that can save it. At the very least, they are at the moment the instruments of the evolutionary forces to save mankind's future. So we come back to these forces working from behind the scenes, using the drives and impulses and greed and egoistic tendencies, as well as the higher aspirations of humanity. At the very least, they are for the moment, the instruments of the evolutionary forces to save mankind's future. And these declarations of their own show that they are conscious of it. Interesting. So here we have to look at who are the persons who were conscious of this. And one of them at that time, who was an excellent instrument for Sri Aurobindo as declared by him, was Winston Churchill. Other elements and motives there are, but the main issue is here. One has to look at things on all sides to see them steadily and whole. Once more, it is the forces working behind that I have to look at. I don't want to go blind among surface details. The future has first to be safeguarded. Only then can present problems and contradictions have a chance to be solved and eliminated. Very interesting. So again, it's a long letter. He is actually describing the complexity of the play and the forces of the divine and the asuric and the divine purpose working out, etc. And he says the victory on one side, the allies, would keep the path open for the evolutionary forces. The victory on the other side would drag back humanity, degrade it horribly, and might even at the worst to its failure as a race, as others in the past evolution failed and perished. You see how close things were to a complete loss of all the civilizational values that had been built up till now. Had the Axis powers won, and the failure of the race as others in the past evolution failed and perished. And this points to many such past attempts where in fact such a point of transition came and there was a failure, of which we do not have recorded history memory anymore. Further, and I'm skipping quite a large part, he is still a very, very long letter, several pages. And then he says something very interesting about the dharma. And well, I think, okay, so this is where it comes. The modern ideas on the subject, the right of all to liberty, both individuals and nations, the immorality of conquest and empire, or short of such absolutist ideas, such compromises as the British idea of training subject races for democratic freedom are new values, an evolutionary movement, a new dharma which has only begun slowly and initially to influence practice. An infant dharma that would be throttled for good if Hitler succeeded in his mission and established his new religion over all the earth. It's very important. Look at the keywords. I'm going to repeat this again. The modern ideas on the subject. The right of all to liberty, both individuals and nations. The immorality of conquest and empire. Short of such absolutist ideas, such compromises as the British idea of training subject races for democratic freedom are new values, an evolutionary movement, a new dharma. And it is still fragile. And there's a phrase I edited while reading. He says, if Hitler succeeded in his, quote, avataric mission and established his new, quote, religion over all the earth. And there's something very important about this. It's a bit dark. What he represented was an attempt to take these spiritual truths and warp them into their very opposite. So there will be an incarnation of an asura who would be an avatar, not of the divine, but of the asura, and a religion that it was building, it was creating. Those of you who have studied that would know what this is pointing to. Sri Aurobindo continues, subject nations naturally accept the new dharma and severely criticize the old imperialism. It is to be hoped that they will practice what they now preach when they themselves become strong and rich and powerful. Interesting. So the British Empire was used to imprint this new dharma and these new values in a mass of humanity simultaneously based on a common vocabulary and a common frame of ideas. For this to happen by natural evolution in each culture, race, nation, civilization would have been much more slow, and not enough places on earth were ready as cultures or civilizations even. Many were still in tribal structures. So it needed as if a dominating influence to force them together to form a kind of a temporary, half-hearted national identity, which is what you see in many parts of Africa, and impose these ideas with a common vocabulary. If not for that, there would have been patches and then again large patches which were contrary. So in order for this new evolutionary leap to take place, it was necessary for some vehicle, and the British Empire became that vehicle, to hold a large part of humanity together in a common vocabulary with these ideas, planting those seeds in a people subjugated for their own freedom, so that when the subjugation is withdrawn, hopefully they will be able to live by those freedoms. You look at the Middle East, it did not work. Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan have been massive examples of failures, and many others. In large parts of Africa, similarly, the same thing happened. There was a half-hearted attempt to live by those values, and then a collapse, and then now again a push. So still the seeds were planted under that colonial phase. You see, we have to look at things differently. Even colonization, whatever its other limitations, was used for this purpose. But the best will be if a new world order evolves which will make the old things impossible. A difficult task, but not, with God's grace, absolutely impracticable. Fascinating the way Sri Aurobindo is looking at all this, and this is sometime in 1945, 46, probably. It was just before India's independence. And then he explains the larger picture behind. The divine takes men as they are and uses them as his instruments, even if they are not flawless in character, without stain or sin or fault, exemplary in virtue, or angelic, holy and pure. If they are of goodwill, if, to use a biblical phrase, they are on the Lord's side, that is enough for the work to be done. Interesting. They are of goodwill, that is enough for the work to be done. Even if I knew that the allies, I'm speaking of the big nations, America, Britain, China, would misuse their victory or bungle the peace, or partially at least spoil the opportunities opened to the human world by that victory, I would still put my force behind them. And now we understand why. At any rate, things would not be 100th part as bad as they would be under Hitler. The ways of the Lord would still be open. To keep them open is what matters. Let us stick to the real issue and leave for a later time all side issues and minor issues or hypothetical problems that would cloud the one all-important and tragic issue before us. And this is how he ends the letter. And then again, he puts a very long footnote to this PS and then a whole long thing. So those of you who are interested, he even mentions the American bombs and airplanes and all that. All of those he has to set aside for this one objective. And that's the picture in which we can appreciate the work for which the British Empire was used, and in a sense why, perhaps even from the divine point of view, it was allowed to build using the wealth of India and the strength of India even, while at the same time building a base in India but also working on the world. In a sense, it was what India could not have done on her own, used by this British overlay on India, now doing it, but using the strength and wealth of India, which was disunited for that work. Whatever the other consequences and side issues, this was the relationship of the British Empire with India. And 2 days ago, this changed. With the Queen's passing and with the shift in India also publicly declared something has ended that phase and a different phase will now begin. Hopefully, with this, India will come into her own more directly and be able to now play that role which she should have played then more directly, more openly, and taking the responsibility and not needing distortions or impositions from outside. And this is what we have to look towards. I think this would broadly cover what the question points to, but with having the satisfaction of gone well beyond the question itself to a deeper understanding. We can go to the next question.
Maya's second question is regarding a geographic region. I was watching an older video from your series Evenings with Sraddhalu, where Narad spoke of the early years in Auroville. In that video, similarities between Auroville's design and Epcot Disneyland were made. Similarly, the recent Dubai 2020 Expo design is very similar to the design of Auroville. It has a large spherical dome structure in the center with pavilions and gardens around it, representing other countries in the world. Although many people criticize Dubai as being overly materialistic and lacking in any spiritual sentience, I was wondering if there was some sort of higher force supporting their creative vision and rapid development. Aesthetically wise, they pay a lot of attention to beauty, symmetry, and harmony, and they are at the cutting edge of new technology and smart cities. They are also one of the only Middle Eastern cities to openly allow practice of all religions and promote tolerance. Is their success due to the fact that they are a very new city and therefore do not have a karmic footprint slowing their progress? Of course, it is well known that they have to not treat all members of society equally, especially in regards to migrant workers in the construction and service industries. Do you have any insights on this materially advanced city, and if they have a bright future, or if they are just a temporary flame in the wind?
Yes, it's an interesting question. Again, there are many aspects to the question. The question itself is quite complex. I will look at 2 or 3 of these from, again, the deeper perspective. And let's recognize that there are always negative aspects to the picture, which we are going to ignore and look at something which gives a better insight of what's happening behind the scenes and the direction it would go to. First, notice that the Dubai and generally the conglomeration of 6 United Arab Emirates, I believe that's how it is. This is the only patch in the Middle East which does not have oil or minerals. It's just bare desert sand. And it's not by chance that Dubai is what it is. Consider it this way. Wherever on earth you will notice oil and minerals, diamonds, gold, etc., mines potentially, you will find, wherever you find them on earth, just on top above the earth, you will find strife, conflict, war, poverty, subjugation, lack of education, everywhere. Fascinating. Now, you could say that this is actually being done by certain cabal interests and multinationals now control those areas, trigger the wars to keep people fighting, distracted, and then they own the politicians of those countries, pay them money, and then own the mines. Yes, perhaps. But remember, these are still instruments of forces behind. So there is a physical image of it, which Mother refers to. You will find wherever there's a treasure, often they say there is a snake guarding the treasure. And the snake represents vital forces. So wherever there is wealth, because wealth has been in the hands of the Asuric and vital forces for so many millennia now, ever since the ascetic phase took over the world and asceticism rejected wealth and power, you find this seizing by the Asuric energy, and wherever there is wealth, there will be some kind of an energetic pull of vital forces which will try to own and control and not allow others to use. And you have to pass through them to reach the wealth. Now, this is the occult formation behind. Practically, physically, it takes the form that in those areas you will find despots, rulers, conflicts, wars, divisions, etc., enslavement. Just as an example, in India, one of the most mineral rich regions is Orissa. It was also left one of the most poor. It's where all the mines are happening, the mining activity, but people have been kept poor as if, and it's difficult to figure out who's doing it because India is so well integrated, even state-wise. It's not even the state rulers, it's forces working through their minds. So just as the divine works through the minds of human beings as influences, so to the other side. So if you have the goodwill, then you're more aligned to the divine. If you don't have the goodwill, you're more aligned to the other side. And then the multinational interests, of course, the moment they know there is the wealth, they are attracted, or some of them are attracted to that space even before knowing it. End result is, in the Middle East, wherever there was oil or mineral wealth, you see this complete domination of despotic rulers, except the United Arab Emirates, which had nothing. So in a sense, they became some of the poorest potentially, while all the others were becoming rich, and they made a decision. And this is where the light worked. They aligned to something higher and said, if we can't get this wealth, we will get other forms of wealth. And there was a strategic intent with a positive intention to build wealth by other means. So becoming a hub for airlines, for tourists, for travel, for new innovation, and so on. Once this caught on, it became an end in itself, and a kind of a higher value system began to rule. So whatever money they got, because it is also, it's not a democratic structure, you don't have people fighting, there are the emirate families who control. They have to show people how generous they are, how good they are, how far-seeing they are. So it's a completely controlled propaganda machine. When you're used to freedom and conflicting viewpoints elsewhere, it's so obvious. But at the end of the day, in the need to show and the need to do some good for their people, there is always this attempt to do something different, to do something new. So this is where we come now to the expos. Every time there is an expo and they're trying to attract tourists, they need to create a positive image for the world, an image of goodness and tolerance and multicultural, etc., but never losing their basic religious base. And this makes it a very interesting place. So what would have been a negative tyrannical force now becomes a positive. There's the phrase that the mother used as regarding India, where she said, what India needs is a dose of benevolent dictatorship. A very interesting idea, because otherwise there were too many clashes, too many fragmented pieces. A benevolent dictatorship would unite, but with good intention. And you see that in the region of United Arab Emirates. Not everywhere equally. Dubai is particularly one which seems to be the place with the maximum character of higher opening. What they do is, they themselves may not have certain capabilities. They'll try to attract the best resources, the best minds, the best examples, the best technologies from all over the world with the money that they have. And so this is interesting to see. It's as if it becomes a focal point for, like a melting pot, for the best things to be pulled and to make a show. Since the goal is to show, the first focus is on this external appearance. In consciousness, it may not change much. But in terms of external forms, you have some of the most extraordinary things. So you have some of the best zoos, some of the best aquariums, and so on. But still, the mentality behind has not changed too much. This is just as a side observation. And that's the reason why the migrant workers in the construction, etc., are treated as slaves. That's a fact. But on the other side, what they're building is led by, as if by the highest, most visionary minds which have been pulled from all over the world. Coming to this specific Dubai Expo, I wanted to, it was, Maya sent the link, so it was quite fascinating to see that, and I would like to share this as a picture for everyone to see. I think we can do this. Let me see how this works. Yeah. So it should be showing now the picture on your screen. This is the picture of the expo. You notice something quite fascinating. First of all, it's like lotus petals, 3 lotus petals which have opened up, and then there are two squares on the side, but it's actually 5 faces. And then there is this portion in front which is just the entrance. So 5 faces. You recall Auroville's logo, which is 5 sectors, which you can see spiritually and psychologically the unification of the psychological perfection opening to a spiritual perfection, and then the petals opening out, you see, in 5 directions, with 3 predominantly almost like lotus petal in shape, and right in the center is this structure which is almost an exact replica of the Matri Mandir with the discs on top of the dome. Quite fascinating. Except a little bit on the side, you will see there's a longish lines instead of the full circles. Quite fascinating. And then let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. You will see, you can see more closely. I hope this is visible to everybody. Quite fascinating. Otherwise, you could go on the website. Now, I'll show you another view of this. Let me take a moment to close this. Yeah, it was just like the Matri Mandir, quite amazing. I will show you another view of this, which is from another screen, which we will also look at now. And here you are. Now this is slightly angled, and we're going to zoom in. So as we zoom in, you notice there's of course the Matri Mandir, and then around it, well, instead of, it's not quite 4 pillars, but you at least see 3 pillars, and where it would have been the 4th pillar is an entrance with 2 sides. Okay, so even that is quite fascinating. But just next to it, look at this. This looks like the amphitheater. Isn't that amazing? It's the exact same shape. And here you have 2 other structures which also have, well, at least a similar idea, but they're not quite the amphitheater. But this part which is in the center, which is so perfectly a replica of the Matri Mandir, isn't it? Okay, so for me, this was just an occasion for also playing with the technology of sharing an image of a screen. So we come to the discussion. How is this possible? Is there something behind it? You remember the discussion on Epcot, which we had way back in one of the early sessions of the evening series with Narad, where Epcot in Disneyland, which was a vision of Walt Disney, was built in the same structure as Auroville, with the same idea. Epcot is experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Perfect description of Auroville itself. As you enter, there's a huge sphere, like the Matri Mandir. You go inside it in a train which goes in a spiral, just like in the Matri Mandir, but it's a train. And when you reach the top, where there would be the meditation chamber, instead there is an artificial sky with the stars projected. So it's as if you're opening out to a cosmic consciousness. Fascinating. Okay, so you come down from this and then you go into the space proper, where they have all kinds of experimental researches for different kind of plants, how to grow plants in desert, and things for water and air and etc. And there are rides for children, entertainment, education. There's a whole section where they take you through trains to see the new kinds of vegetables that can be grown in desert land and so on. And huge vegetables, really large, which you've never seen them so big. But then in the center is a lake. At the center of the lake is another globe, which is shrunk and then which opens out and becomes large, which is a map of the earth. And surrounding the lake are the pavilions of all the civilizations of the world, or major civilizations of the world. Not all, but the intention is eventually to have all. And each presents in its pavilion the best foods, textiles, culture, dance, music, art, the best of its culture. Exactly the same content of what Mother wanted in the pavilions in Auroville. It's quite fascinating. And I've actually got an interview of Walt Disney. Now, I think it's unavailable. It was one of those torrent downloads I once got, where he is discussing his vision for this. And it seemed as if he was visioning something, and as he's describing, but you know that this whole thing took place after Auroville was announced. So perhaps he read of it, perhaps was not conscious here, but received the same ideal or archetype that Mother had envisaged for Auroville and was working to project and manifest it on earth. So those which were receptive minds got that, and he happens to be one of those. He had the resources. Well, he built it before Auroville. Of course, it's not of the same object, it's not an entire community, but you have every day thousands of people from all over the world, and every year millions of people from all over the world coming, spending time there, sometimes spending a few days, sometimes half a day or one day, experiencing whatever it has to provide. And what it is providing is very similar to Auroville, without the obvious content of spirituality. Everything else without the spirituality is there. Fascinating. So it's as if up there is the spiritual vision which is now being brought down on earth, being manifested, and all the way to the material. But before it reaches the material, already minds which are open catch, life inspired people who are open on the vital level, they catch. And then those on the physical, or who can translate to the physical, they try to articulate with distortions, with limitations, partially, whatever they've been able to catch of the vision. So when it comes to Dubai, since the goal was to create this amazing expo that would be a pride for Dubai in relation to the world, everything, they have to have the highest building and the most beautiful this and the most wonderful that. So it's as if they've opened out what's the best we could do. And either the designers got the same idea, or they knew of Auroville and were somehow influenced and not willing to say it, but it doesn't matter. The idea is there is something, an archetype, a spiritual truth, principle, power, like in a seed form, which is manifesting on earth. The fact that they caught it and could replicate almost in form, even the pattern of 5 and so on, is to me a sign that the force or the power or the truth of Auroville is close enough on the brink of manifestation that everywhere people who are ready and looking for the future catch it and then translate it into what they can. Of course, external forms, that's all they can do. Some aspect of the spirit, of the newness, of the breakthrough, the future, new consciousness, new possibilities, something of that, but missing that spiritual, which should distinguish Auroville from the rest. And that's why what has to be done in Auroville is so important. Because these things others can do, and they can do it better also. But the spiritual content, for that you need people who are tuned to that, who want to live for that. And even in Auroville, there are not enough. There are many who come and just say, yes, it's a eco-village, they will say. No, it's not eco-village. It's a spiritual township. Eco-sustainable technologies are an aspect of it, but it's not an eco-village. You can have many eco-villages all over the world. That's not Auroville was for. So we do have this gap even within Auroville, among some of the Aurovillians, and some who have it are clear about what they have. But this is why Auroville is so important, and the spiritual content of Auroville to be realized is so essential. So I think this gives us a good enough picture about Auroville and the link with Epcot, as well as this new expo of Dubai. We can go to the third question. So this question will be our closing question. I've not had time to look at the chat box, but let me complete this question. This is from Maureen.
I can
Yes, okay,
read the
you're
last
back.
question. Maureen is writing, as you were outlining the ancient traditions' knowledge of the vast evolutionary cycles, the concept of intelligent design immediately comes into mind. I would wonder and very much appreciate your insights into the possibility that this design is managed by a vastly developed hierarchy of beings. It is stated in various traditions that if it were not for the presence of certain individuals on this planet, and I will quote, there would be no life on this planet. These are not casual statements, and I bring them up because a better understanding of what they imply may make for a better individual alignment when personal exercises, meditation, for instance, take place. Also, it might give a little more clarity to the subjective age into which we have entered, making this age more clearly in harmony, even though it is not how we experienced it, with the greater design. Doris Lessing, in her science fiction series Canopus in Argos, 1978, touched on aspects of our current situation with a great deal of insight, begging the question that on some level the author may have been directed, and I use that term in a broad context, to enlarge the human perspective of our times.
Very important question from Maureen. There are, as we have this knowledge of vast evolutionary cycles that we spoke of last time and a little bit now, the idea that there is some kind of an intelligence that is managing these cycles, managing circumstances, it becomes almost inevitable. And she says there are traditions which claim that if there would be no life on this planet, if not for the presence of certain individuals, but I will say behind those individuals, certain forces. And I would not on my own give too much importance to linking this to individual alignments of personal exercises and worrying too much about the subjective age. You see, the forces behind are operating irrespective of where you are. You do not need to focus on individuals. Occasionally, certain individuals will incarnate or represent certain ideas or forces or actions, etc. And to that extent, you can, of course, you may choose to align or not. But more important is to recognize this is the mood of an age. We started the discussion today with the Queen Elizabeth II of England, and in a sense, she represented a certain age and the mood of a certain age and even certain possibilities that came with that mood. With or without her, that would have been there, or it would have found other instruments if it was necessary. But this idea rather that there is a certain mood, and when the mood comes, everybody in the mood just gets carried away. And I'll give a few examples here. And this is again going back to the first question of Queen Elizabeth, that at some point in humanity to have slaves was considered normal. There are even events in human evolution in the last few hundred years where those who had caught the idea of freedom, individual freedom and national freedom, freed the slaves, and the slaves were unhappy because they wanted to have this relationship of somebody that they hero worship and serve with their lives, and they felt here was something superior, that it made our lives worthy by serving them. This was also present. It's not that all slaves were suppressed and oppressed people. That was also there, but this was also there. And they were willing slaves, happy slaves, to be in service of what they saw to be so much greater. And we see some of this in some of the very old cultures. And almost sometimes there would be lineages, families, which would be in service of other families and would still hold that reverence. Something of that is still there in some of the spaces where there is a sense of royalty. It's not always justified, because sometimes the royalty of today is worse than the ordinary corrupt civilian. But where the royalty actually held something higher, this was almost felt as if justified. And I'm saying this because when that mood was there, it was felt by all as normal. Similarly, in the relationship where we see today this women's lib and freedom of women, independence of women, the going back barely 100 years ago, it's not so strong. Women were dependent. There were certain situations, biological often, which made them vulnerable. And as long as humanity was somewhat barbaric, it needed a man to protect a woman. And so the relationship was naturally one of protection and a need to be protected. Exaggerate in an extreme direction, that becomes enslavement. Exaggerate in the other direction, and you find a different relationship of these two, where the woman, once protected, now begins to take charge, which also happens. You will find all these all over the world. But a woman living on her own and independently was not considered acceptable, was not considered safe. And women were treated always as needing protection, requiring protection by something, someone, sometimes even a group. This changed. It changed when nature said, okay, now that phase is over, the mood shifts. And the mood shifted all over the world. In places which were too entrenched in past habit, although the mood has changed, the form has not, which you see in the Middle East. In other places which were more open and free, the change took place radically, suddenly, and everyone said, yes, okay. Women really didn't have to fight for it in those spaces. They just had to say, I want to be free, and that was, yeah, of course. It's obvious, it's normal. Yeah, I'm here to help you to be free. And men also accepted it, women also accepted it as normal. The struggle is where it is against some kind of a past habit. It's not about patriarchy, it's about habit. Patriarchy was strong, as was matriarchy. Both have their strengths and limitations. So I'm pointing to a shift in an age and a mood of the age. So what you see on earth is this shifts taking place with certain aspects of the divine, certain powers, certain influences put out deliberately to shape and guide events on earth. With all that, there is the other side which wants to delay and even harm evolution, which puts out its own influences. And so you have the spiritual struggle of powers reflected in the human struggles and conflicts of the agents of those powers, embodiments or influences in human beings of those powers. But there is always this thing happening from behind the scenes where, as required, there's a very complex play from above, rhythms of moods of the ages, yogas even. Sri Aurobindo speaks of the four deities, four aspects which preside over the four yogas: Sri Krishna, Balarama, Pradyumna, and what was his son? Fourth. Interesting. The vocabulary is very distinct, and the sense of the names will give you a hint of what they represent. I won't go into that. It's one of those texts of Sri Aurobindo which is very mystical and very deep. And then in one of his own writings regarding himself, he refers to which aspect he's primarily embodying. This is to say that they're literally cycles. In the Indian tradition, they will say, there is the Manu, yes, Aniruddha. Fourth is the Aniruddha. So in the Indian tradition itself, you have heard the name of Manu, but they speak of many Manus. Each Manu represents a special aspect of the divine to be replaced by the next Manu when that age ends and the new mood starts. And it's as if the whole mind of humanity now shifts and becomes, oh yes, of course, this is how it should be. And we shift into the next Manu, Mana coming from the mind consciousness, the mood which is set of the type of humanity. He is like the prototype of this age, of this mood. Beyond that are powers, angels, forces, and then occasionally the vibhutis of these different powers, aspects, taking incarnation for specific purposes, to push, to nudge, to align, to embody, to incarnate, to spread, and occasionally severe radical entries to make radical changes or protections. One of these, which I keep referring to in all these examples, is one of the most extraordinary in Europe, was the example of Joan of Arc, a woman picked up from a peasant community and then made to defeat an entire trained army of men with just a few words spoken, and then later even with war, with fighting and so on. And it's like a human being is picked up and there's this infusion of the Divine Mother's consciousness that lifts her, Mahakali aspect most likely, and is able to make that, and then withdraws. The woman is left or not. We hear nothing of her beyond the point, okay, she is finally burnt at the stake, but that's about it. Work done, the power withdraws, she becomes helpless. If that woman still had the power, she could have just as well walked away free, not needing to be burnt alive. It was already because the power had withdrawn, she could become vulnerable to that kind of an attack. But all this is to say that it's a very complex mix, and there are powers which are constantly doing their job, their aspect. They don't always know the other side. So there are fragmented powers in the lower ranges of the mind and the vital, each doing its aspect in its spaces. Sometimes they may collide. If they're divinely aligned, then even if there's a collision, it's my territory, your territory. Some separation takes place. Occasionally intermixtures between those distinct patches. There are equally, coming to that later. From there, the vital, there is the elemental entities which work hard to create, to nourish, to maintain balance of species, where the species balance is severely disrupted, to reintroduce the species. And this is happening at the level of nature and the forest ecology. On a little patch of the forest, there are little gnomes, fairies, dwarfs, which do their work of maintaining the plants. Sometimes there's a gnome or a dwarf for one set of plants. And the king of the plants is, so to say, protected, and the plants nourished and assisted in developing certain medicinal qualities which are infused as their genetic structure is modified by the infusion of consciousness to build the quality needed, which is the job of this particular dwarf being. If we had the occult sight to really see this, we would see huge machinery of beings working behind the scenes to make this physical world and life, and to maintain its balance, and to push its evolution, and to correct for the imbalances and dangers and so on, at each step, navigating, pushing, nudging. And so yes, there is on the highest level all these powers. On the lower levels, tinier, smaller, tinier aspects, where of course you can have collisions and conflicts, all the way down, even at the level of the ants, at the level of the bacteria. It's a complex thing, where occasionally even animals have become extinct. They have been brought back by these beings, reintroduced into the habitat. And separately from these are physical terrestrial beings who are of an angelic incarnation. They take on sometimes human form just to provide the protection and limited interventions for certain very specific tasks. And then there are the extraterrestrial beings. They don't really belong to our physical domain. From the subtle, they may incarnate or materialize, or sometimes they are from other planets who are guided by a higher evolutionary purpose and who come and assist sometimes where needed, even protecting and intervening. For example, during the time when there was the Cold War and Earth could have been destroyed multiple times over by the nuclear weapons with their trigger-happy machines and human beings behind. And it happened at least in the United States, we have the data, it happened at least 5 or 6 times that they were on the brink of launching the missiles because the computer showed an attack from Russia, from the Soviet Union. And at the last stage, someone said, hey, let's check with them. And there was a hotline, they called up and found no, there was nothing. Earth would have been wiped out multiple times already by now. There was this powers, spiritual powers pushing into these human beings, wake up, be careful. And at the same time, there were these extraterrestrial beings ready to intervene if needed, even to neutralize those weapons, if it came to that. Or if the divine command said, no, do not interfere, they would not interfere and even watch humanity destroy itself if that was the divine command, at least for these beings who were aligned to that. All depends on the choices made from above and the relationship of the human beings. So there's a question from Neeraj: are fairies, gnomes, and dwarfs good or bad? Neither. Their job is to look after the plants and do their little things. The specific task for which they are as if created, they do that, and that's it. They don't know what is good or what is bad. They just know how to carry on their work. And sometimes if their work interferes with someone else's work, then you say they're bad. If it helps your work, you say they're good. But they're just doing their work. You will recall that incident of the mother and she summoning the dwarfs who were throwing the stones. And she said they don't have a sense of good or bad. They're just doing their job. But this is to say, this is one side, and then there is equally the Asuric forces which are trying to, doing their job, which is to seize all and control all because that's their nature. And through the forces of the vital world which align to that darkness, to sabotage, to destroy, to harm, to delay evolution and even reverse evolution. So what you have as a picture here is something extremely complex. To manage the evolutionary progress of a planet, of a species, and to prevent it from destroying itself multiple times over. It's a humongous task. And there's like as if a whole hierarchy on all the planes just tuned to this. But those planes are also infinite. Each of them has worlds entire where they don't care. They have nothing to do with the earth, and there are infinity of worlds where they're just happy doing their own thing, unaware of what might happen to the earth or not. But equally on each level, there are beings who are aligned and who are interested in this. So I think this would give a reasonably good picture of what Maureen is asking. She makes reference to Doris Lessing and her sci-fi series Canopus in Argos. So I've not read these books, but I looked through on Wikipedia for the summary of the storylines of these books, where there is this idea of higher beings assisting lesser beings to evolve and, so to say, managing them without them knowing necessarily, sometimes with them knowing. From what I saw in the summary, the idea is valid, but it's missing something extremely important. That these higher beings are not merely technologically more advanced or intellectually more developed. The reality is the higher beings who are guiding Earth's destiny are spiritually more developed. Now, this is very difficult to bring into a novel or a cinema, because first of all, the common man who's watching the movie will not be able to understand this higher consciousness. What motivates a being to act this way and not that? If it is from a consciousness which is so different from our intellectual mind, then we don't understand their motivations. It seems arbitrary. Or we have to reduce it to some fake moral, ethical values. What's your concept, let's say, of a divine being that comes? Oh, it will always be good. It will always serve. It will always do more good for others than for itself. It will sacrifice itself. All this you'll find in the New Age vocabulary of what is spirituality. In reality, the spiritual beings, including extraterrestrial physical beings, with their vehicles by which they could stop an atomic war, and they have the technology, they will wait. And if the divine command says, save the earth, they would act immediately, even if they had to die, yes. But if the divine command was no, do not interfere, well, they would allow and watch with pain, watching the human beings destroy themselves and not interfere. This doesn't make sense to us. It seems to us so arbitrary, but from a consciousness which can see farther, which can identify with a wider vision, consciousness, embracing, even as you see somebody suffering, you know what you need to do at that moment. Sometimes you're required to allow them to suffering, give them a certain strength in their suffering, but you can't remove that because it's needed for them to awaken. And from the point where they're awake, then you help them and guide them to the extent they're ready to listen. Otherwise, you have to wait and do nothing. Watch them helplessly refuse help when they could have not suffered anymore, and still you say, okay, what can I do? But I'll be there the moment they're ready, I will help. And that is something difficult for us to understand. You can't make a movie or a sci-fi novel out of it, because the reader won't understand. It won't be interesting, and it's too far out even for perhaps the author's vision. So what I found missing in that was the real higher consciousness. It was always higher technology or higher intelligence, which we can relate to. And you have the same problem which you saw under Hitler, of course, where the superior race dominating an inferior or controlling it in a certain way. Those tendencies would tend to happen. Of course, as I said, I have not read the book, but this is the impression that I had from it, from what I saw as summary. But yes, these things help us to understand, oh yes, perhaps there is a higher power that is guiding us or navigating and managing us. And you'll find this suggested in many ways, in many traditions. So I've given perhaps a sense of the complexity of these things. Quickly looking at the chat box, there was a question. I've given the links to the two things that I referred to, both from Sri Aurobindo's letter as well as the Dubai Expo. I've given you links for those who have asked for it. I want to complete with this idea what we have been discussing about our Earth and the complex management. Who is finally in charge, especially as regards our Earth? Is there such a thing as a being? Yes, we know of a planetary consciousness of Earth itself. But is there such a thing as a spiritual being or a spiritual consciousness presiding over the planet itself? I'm not speaking here of the vital astrological consciousness. So you see, in the astrology, you can look at each planet from a higher consciousness and you can see a personality, a being, which characterizes the psychological qualities of that planet and therefore the influences which it has on others. And Earth is a feminine being, Mars is a masculine being, Venus is a mixed type, and so on. And the qualities that they radiate, Earth has a distinctive quality that's different. I'm speaking of a spiritual power and presence. And I don't think we can say that all planets would have that. At least not as a special incarnation of the divine for that purpose. In a sense, everything is supported by a spiritual aspect of the divine. But I mean something more distinct here. Our Earth has a special mission in this universe, which Mother has spoken of as the focal point for the psychic evolution. That is, the largest number of psychic units, souls, individualized in each person is focused on Earth. There are other species where there is a sort of, say, group soul or one psychic being for a few people together. But on Earth, it is individualized psychic being, which is the dominant theme as a focal point for the whole universe, as an experiment, so to say. So something very special happening, for which the preparation goes back to the point where Earth was being formed, perhaps, and the first signs of life emerging. And there we get a glimpse in a letter of the mother, a note, where she writes this. And this was written 1952, March 14th. Since the beginning of the earth, wherever and whenever there was the possibility of manifesting a ray of consciousness, I was there. Elsewhere, in another message earlier, she said, that which is speaking to you now, speaking of herself, is a faithful servant of the divine. From all time, since the beginning of the earth, as a faithful servant of the divine, it has spoken in the name of its master. And as long as earth and men exist, it will be there in a body to preach the divine word. So wherever I am asked to speak, I do my best as a servant of the divine. But to speak in the name of a particular doctrine or of a man, however great he may be, that I cannot do. The eternal transcendent forbids me. And then, she has this famous statement of 1920 February. I belong to no nation, no civilization, no society, no race, but to the divine. I obey no master, no ruler, no law, no social convention, but the divine. To him I have surrendered all, will, life, self. For him I am ready to give all my blood, drop by drop, if such is his will, with complete joy. And nothing in his service can be sacrifice, for all is perfect delight. So, having said this, there's another very interesting discussion she has, which is recorded in the agenda, where I read from that. She says, "You know, my child, I said one day that in the history of the earth, whenever there was a possibility for the consciousness to manifest, I was there. This is a fact. It's like the story of Savitri. Always there, always there, always there. In this one, that one. At certain times, there were 4 emanations simultaneously. At the time of the Italian and French Renaissance." Very interesting. In France, in Italy, overall 4 emanations simultaneously. At the time of the Italian and French Renaissance, and again at the time of Christ, then 2. Oh, you know, I have remembered so many, many things. It would take volumes to tell it all. And then, more often than not always, but more often than not, what took part in this or that life was a particular yogic formation of the vital being, in other words, something immortal. And when I came this time, as soon as I took up the yoga, they came back again from all sides. They were waiting. So it's as if those incarnations and the particular vital formation which was the special focus or the vehicle for the embodiment, those were still there. And so they came to merge into this incarnation. You see. Some were simply waiting, others were working. They led their own independent lives, and they all gathered together again. That's how I got those memories. One after the other, those vital beings came, a deluge. I had barely enough time to assimilate one, to see, situate and integrate it, and another would come. They're quite independent, of course. They do their own work, but they're very centralized all the same. And there are all kinds, anything you can imagine. Some of them have even been men. They're not exclusively feminine. When I met Sri Aurobindo, they would come to me night after night, and sometimes during the day, a mass of things. Afterwards, I told Sri Aurobindo about it, and he explained to me that it was quite natural. And indeed, it is quite natural, with the present incarnation of the Mahashakti, as he described it in Savitri. Whatever is more or less bound up with her wants to take part. That's quite natural. And it's particularly true for the vital. There has always been a preoccupation with organizing, centralizing, developing and unifying the vital forces and controlling them. So there's a considerable number of vital beings, each with its own particular ability, who have played their role in history and now return. And then she speaks of one particular white being, and she says about that, it is a being that had already incarnated and is one of those who presided over the formation of this present being, that is the mother. But as I said, I saw it. It was sexless, neither male or female. I got a very good description of it in one of Sri Aurobindo's plays when he speaks of the goddess Athena. She has that kind of almighty calm and with such authority. So then she speaks of the various gods and things. But this is to say, then I skip again. During the whole time Sri Aurobindo was here, the 4 entities he speaks of, the 4 aspects of the mother were always present. And I was constantly obliged to tell one or the other of them, now keep calm, now calm down. They were always inclined to intervene. So she's describing things like this, quite amazing description. But this is to say that when this time the incarnation was the most complete ever, naturally all those different aspects and powers which had been put out for specific purposes during history, they all surged to flow into her. It's a very interesting portion during the time when Sri Aurobindo was doing the automatic writing as an experiment. Whatever it was that was coming through the automatic writing, which often he said were things from the deeper subliminal ranges. When it was asked about Sri Aurobindo, I think it said there were 13 aspects. When somebody asked, what about her? That was Mira Alfasa, because she was not yet the mother. What about her? And the thing said 200. She has 200 aspects, very rich personality. And I thought that interesting. And there was another time when someone had asked about her, and mother said, no, enough. And the hand stopped and it wouldn't come through. But anyway, all this is to give you some glimpse of the mother's role when she speaks of this. And it need not always be the way we know her in this form, in this name, as the mother. But she says, wherever there was an opportunity for consciousness, she was present. Sri Aurobindo was asked, well, mother said this, where were you? So 1935, someone asks, it is said that you and mother have been on earth since its creation. But what have you been doing for so many millions of years in disguise? I say disguise because it is only now that you're showing yourself to the world in your real nature. Sri Aurobindo's reply, brief, carrying on the evolution. So it sounds like Nirod Baran, I don't know, but he says, I fail to understand what you mean by carrying on the evolution. Would you explain more fully? Sri Aurobindo. That would mean writing the whole of human history. I can only say that as there are special descents to carry on the evolution to a farther stage, so also something of the divine is always there to help through each stage itself in one direction or another. So the person persists. It's a pretty long series of letters. Those of you who are interested can look at it. And so this person asks, what is it even, how is it even Krishna, Buddha or Christ could not recognize your presence? So Sri Aurobindo replies, presence where and in whom? If they did not meet, they would not recognize. And even if they met, there is no reason why the mother and I should cast off the veil which hung over these personalities and reveal the divine behind them. Those lives were not meant for any such purpose. Very interesting. So you remember mother speaking about being there at the time of Christ's incarnation, that she was around in some manifestation. So he explains that later the inner being can hide itself in the veiling in a particular vibhuti, we will say, secondary incarnation, not necessarily a full avataric incarnation. He says, if mother were in Rome at the time of Buddha, how could the Buddha know? For example, they don't have to meet physically. But then even if one could, he says, what would be the point? And he says, even vibhutis need not be omniscient or know these things for their work. Now, very specifically, he again repeats this in another letter. There was no reason why Buddha should know what was going on in Rome. An avatar even does not manifest all the divine omniscience and omnipotence. He has not come for any such unnecessarily display. All that is behind him, but not in the front of his consciousness. But for the vibhuti need not even know that he is a power of the divine. Some vibhutis, like Julius Caesar, for instance, have been atheists. Buddha himself did not believe in a personal God. And then he says, why should these incarnations which were there at that time reveal? The veil was there necessary for their work. Why should it be thrown off? So if the mother was present in the life of Christ, she was there not as the divine manifestation, but as one altogether human. For her to be recognized as the divine would have created a tremendous disorder and frustrated the work Christ came to do by breaking its proper limits. Very interesting insight here. So even as there are these special vibhutis and incarnations, there is this special other aspect which is there to support, to assist, and sometimes unknown. Unknown even to those special vibhutis, that there is this other aspect that is there, working, protecting, sometimes secretly guiding. I believe there was one such in the life of Louis XIV, one of his mistresses, which was a special emanation from the mother's consciousness, which was there to help him and to inspire. So final question. Since you and mother were on earth constantly from the beginning, what was the need for avatars coming down here one after another? Sri Aurobindo's reply, we were not on earth as avatars. So it's a fascinating series of letters. I will end with this point now. We have this big picture, we have this special presence of the planetary consciousness and its embodiment in human forms, sometimes more overt, sometimes extremely covert, but always present in some form or other wherever there is an opportunity for evolution to push forward the consciousness. That is the nature of the divine commitment to Earth's spiritual evolution. Medhananda, one of the disciples here, had this experience where he found himself out of his body, lost in the universe in some other planet, and he couldn't get back. He didn't know what to do. He kept asking those beings, how do I get back to my Earth? They said, what Earth? We don't know what you're talking about. Finally, he said, I want to go back to Sri Aurobindo's planet. And whoosh, he was pulled back and found himself in his body. So this gives you a hint of the presiding consciousness. It is a special aspect of the divine presiding over the Earth's spiritual evolution, always present. And as we saw, always present to push forward the evolution, including within each one of us. Every time you and I, all of us, each person in the whole world says, but, and we turn with an aspiration. The pressure of that consciousness is there giving you the nudge. That's all that is needed from your part. Simply turn in quiet aspiration to this evolutionary purpose, and the help is there. And then if you consciously open to this help and say, help me, there is the infusion, like an incarnation, but a milder degree of it. The infusion of her consciousness that fills you, lifts you, shapes you, transforms you, to the extent you are ready or to the extent you allow yourself, according to your receptivity and openness. Think about what that means. In one of the passages in the agenda, the mother says, I'm 1,000,000 years old and waiting. And now you know for what. And the moment there is a little bit of the opportunity for the light, for the consciousness to grow, immediately the push. Think of your life in this way. Think of your journey in this way. You've come to where you are today because of those brief moments where you got pushed. Every time there was an opportunity, push, push, push. Not always that we are conscious even of what it meant, because sometimes we have cried and suffered, oh, why this push? It's forcing me to change. I'm uncomfortable. Until we come to that stage where we say, okay, even if there's a little discomfort, the growth is worth it. And if we have come to this now today, we can do so much more. Rather, she can do so much more in us. Now that we can be more willing, even sometimes if there's discomfort and resistance in parts. Think about this. Choose to put yourself in alignment with the divine help of the Divine Mother's love and compassion within you, tender, melting, with all her powers of knowledge, of strength, wisdom, beauty, harmony, perfection, all those waiting, and with love always supporting, nudging, pushing. Will we choose to give her more opportunities for the growth? Or will we go back to sleep? The choice that we make. And that choice we may make a few times in the day. More complete, less complete, more intense, more awake or less, or maybe constant. Choice we make. At least for now, for the next few seconds, we can all concentrate together in this conscious aspiration, in this conscious choice, invoking her help, invoking her presence to lead us, to give us that little nudge, push for our awakening, for the purpose for which we are born.